the metallic whisper of his shoes, a precise, cold click against the polished expanse of the lobby's travertine floor, was the first herald of change. It was a sound like a metronome, steady, purposeful, and, to my attuned ears, slightly too loud an announcement rather than a simple stride. He bypassed the receptionist, his gaze sweeping past her without acknowledgement, and offered no smile to the stoic security guard by the turnstiles. He simply walked in, his expensive leather briefcase, held with an air of absolute authority, as if he already held the deed to the very ground beneath his feet. Technically, he did. This was Christopher Rains, the newly anointed CEO. 30-something, perhaps 32 or 3, he possessed that raw, unblemished youth that often translates into a dangerous overconfidence. There was a gleam in his eyes, a restless ambition that declared the world, and certainly this corporation, was his to dismantle and rebuild in his own image. His appointment, shrouded in the usual corporate euphemisms, had been announced just a week prior in one of those sugar-coated memos about leadership transition and future forward vision. 17 years of navigating these corridors had taught me precisely what such saccharine pronouncements truly signified. Someone upstairs desired a purge, a fundamental shift, and typically, it wasn't their own heads destined to roll. I observed him from the glass wall of my small corner office. It wasn't a sprawling executive suite, but it was far enough removed from the frenetic energy of the interns and the boisterous marketing assistants to afford me the quiet solitude necessary for genuine thought. Christopher, it quickly became apparent, was not a man who knocked. He simply opened doors, interrupting ongoing meetings with the casual impunity of a king surveying his dominion. He moved through the floors with an ever-present tablet clutched in one hand, scribbling incessant notes, firing off questions that permitted no full answers. He smiled yes when people stumbled under his interrogation. Not a cruel smile. Certainly not one born of malice, but the subtle, almost imperceptible upturn of a man's lips when he has already reached a definitive conclusion, when the verdict is already cast. He did not seek me out that day. I suppose I was not yet a blip on his meticulously plotted radar, and for that, I was silently grateful. I preferred it that way for now. At lunch, a small cluster of us, the more senior employees who no longer attempted to mimic the boundless energy of the 20-somethings, gravitated to the break room. Our conversations were often tinged with a quiet cynicism, a shared understanding born of enduring successive waves of corporate fads. Someone, a woman named Beatrice from accounts, quipped that the new CEO reminded her of a substitute teacher who genuinely believed he could reform an entire school in a single week. We all chuckled, a soft, cautious sound, like dry leaves rustling. I stirred my tea, the ceramic mug warm in my hands, and kept my thoughts to myself. I had outlasted 3 CEOs before Christopher. One had departed for health reasons, a sudden, convenient illness that coincided with a failed merger. Another left for legal ones, whispers of misappropriated funds that never quite solidified into public scandal. And the last, he had attempted to outsource more than he could possibly comprehend, severing vital operational arteries in his zealous pursuit of leaner margins. It mattered little how impeccably tailored their suits were, how sharp their pronouncements. They invariably repeated the same fundamental error, mistaking a title for genuine experience, confusing power with competence. Later that afternoon, our paths intersected in the main hallway. As I passed, Christopher's gaze flickered to my ID badge, then traveled straight through me, as if I were a ghost. He didn't register the name, didn't pause to inquire about my function, didn't betray the slightest interest that I was carrying the quarterly performance briefs documents. He would undoubtedly be quoting from in his upcoming Friday presentation. To him, I was merely another indistinct face in the vast, impersonal machinery of the corporation, a cog not worthy of individual inspection. Yet, As I retreated to the familiar sanctuary of my office, a peculiar sensation settled over me. It was the distinct feeling of a tectonic shift, the premonition of a storm brewing. Nothing overtly catastrophic had occurred, not yet, but the nascent signs were palpable. The sudden cessation of desk, side chatter, the way certain managers abruptly avoided eye contact, the unusual pallor that had settled upon Linda, the HR director, this past week. I closed the door behind me, the soft click echoing the one I'd heard earlier, and sank into my chair. There exists a unique stillness that descends upon a place on the precipice of upheaval, a hushed anticipation that I had come to recognize intimately over my long tenure. The following week unfolded like water seeping inexorably beneath a closed door, slowly, steadily, unstoppably. Initially, there were no overt catastrophes, no official memos announcing radical policy shifts, no immediate waves of layoffs. Instead, it was a series of closed-door restructuring meetings, the details of which were only hinted at in hushed conversations in the hallways, conversations that would instantly cease the moment anyone in a suit passed by. I maintained my usual low profile, a strategy I had perfected over the years. I diligently completed my reports, seamlessly coordinated the next critical video conference with Gold Peak Tech in Shenzhen, and drafted polite, meticulously worded emails in Mandarin to smooth over a few minor, almost imperceptible accounting delays. I saw little of Christopher himself, but his presence, a cold front of nervous energy and thinly veiled resentment, permeated every department. It was not long before the initial, more tangible changes began. He started with the mid-level managers, individuals who had dedicated over a decade, sometimes two, to the company. They would be summoned to short, abrupt meetings from which they never returned. There were no formal goodbye emails, no farewell handshakes, just abruptly empty desks and hastily collected personal effects packed into cardboard boxes. Their replacements arrived with startling speed, Christopher's associates mostly. Young men and women with polished resumes, impeccably curated LinkedIn profiles, and a disturbing lack of practical understanding of our actual business operations. They asked rudimentary questions in meetings, requiring concepts to be explained not once, but twice. They made condescending jokes about the old school nature of our established processes, labeling their disruptive changes modernization. I, in my quiet observation, recognized it for what it truly was, a disaster unfolding in agonizing slow motion. I sat through these transitions, absorbing every detail, listening intently. I knew better than to voice my dissent. I understood the fragile nature of stability under men like Christopher. How easily they misinterpret the silence of seasoned employees as agreement, rather than the calculated instinct for survival. It was during a team meeting on Thursday morning that I first felt the prickle of real danger. Christopher was present, of course, standing at the front of the conference room like a general reviewing troops he neither trusted nor particularly valued. He clicked through slides with relentless speed, far too quickly for anyone to truly absorb their content, uttering a stream of buzzwords: efficiency, cost centers, agility. We need to be leaner, he declared, flashing that practiced utterly devoid of warmth grin. We need to aggressively focus on strategic partnerships and eliminate all waste. Every single department will be meticulously evaluated. His gaze did not directly meet mine when he issued this pronouncement, but it didn't need to. I surveyed the faces around the table. Some colleagues shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while others maintained a blank, unreadable composure, staring straight ahead. When the meeting finally concluded, people filed out quietly, their movements subdued. I gathered my papers with deliberate slowness, careful not to be the first or the last to depart. As I rose from my chair, I sensed a presence beside me. "Margaret Wright," Christopher said, his tone a curious blend of query and command, as if trying to place a vague, half-forgotten memory. "Yes," I responded, my voice calm even. He offered that same shallow, practiced smile he bestowed upon everyone. What exactly do you handle again? I paused. I could have recited my official job title, a string of bureaucratic jargon. I could have rattled off my exhaustive list of responsibilities. But I knew, with a cold, clear certainty, that none of it would genuinely register with him. I manage our communications with Gold Peak Tech and our other strategic partners in China. I articulated carefully. His brow furrowed slightly, a momentary crack in his smooth facade. We have someone doing translations, don't we? He asked, dismissively. I don't just translate. I countered, my voice maintaining its even, controlled cadence. I manage the entire relationship, the business etiquette, the intricate cultural expectations, the ongoing negotiations. It's a bit more involved. He nodded, distracted, already half turned towards the door, his attention already elsewhere. Well, good. We'll be streamlining a lot of processes soon. Appreciate the work you're doing. And with that, he was gone, a gust of cool air in his wake. I remained standing for a moment, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, feeling a profound, cold certainty solidify in my bones. He didn't understand. Worse, he didn't want to understand. He was not interested in depth or nuance, only in superficial, quantifiable metrics. Outside the conference room, the office hummed with a forced, almost frantic energy. Typewriters clicked too loudly, phones rang with an unnatural urgency, and meetings were called on impossibly short notice. Linda, the HR director, a woman who had been with the company almost as long as I had, caught my eye as I passed her desk. She offered me a small, sad smile, a silent, eloquent gesture that said, "Be careful. Be very, very careful." Back at my desk, I opened my laptop and began composing an email to Mr. Liang at Gold Peak, a routine update. A seemingly normal communication. But as my fingers moved across the keyboard, a chilling question echoed in my mind. How much longer would I even be permitted to do this? Friday arrived, heavy with the scent of impending rain, and something far more oppressive, dread. The office was unusually quiet, the usual hum of productivity replaced by hushed tones and furtive glances towards closed doors. The pervasive rumor was that another round of realignments was imminent, likely before the weekend could offer its brief respite. At precisely 10:15 a.m., my email client pinged, a meeting request, sender Christopher Rains, time 10:30 a.m., location conference room B. No agenda. No explanation. It was identical to all the others who had vanished this month. I sat very still for a long moment, my hands folded neatly in my lap. A strange sense of calm, almost detachment, settled over me. Then I rose, adjusted the lapels of my jacket, and began the deliberate walk to conference room B. Each step was measured, controlled, as if the very steadiness of my gait could somehow influence the inevitable outcome. When I entered, Christopher was already seated at the head of the polished table, a thin folder placed precisely before him. Linda from HR sat 2 chairs down, her face a carefully constructed mask of neutrality. Her gaze slid past me, avoiding my eyes. Christopher gestured towards the chair directly opposite him. "Margaret. Good to see you," he said, his tone brisk, perfunctory, like someone ticking off an item on a checklist. "Please, have a seat." I sat, my hands resting calmly, almost serenely, on the table. He opened the folder, glanced at its contents for a fleeting moment, and began. "We've been meticulously reviewing our internal structure over the past few weeks, and after careful consideration, we've decided to consolidate certain functions." His voice was smooth, rehearsed, flowing with the practiced cadence of a man delivering bad news he believes is entirely justified. "Your role, while undoubtedly valuable in the past, is unfortunately no longer aligned with the dynamic direction we're moving in. We believe that the external firm we've partnered with for language services can comprehensively cover all the needs we have moving forward. There's simply no longer a requirement for a dedicated liaison." I listened without interruption, a silent witness to my own corporate demise. Not a flicker of emotion crossed my face. I was long past shock, long past the futile stages of bargaining. This was, in its stark simplicity, the end of this chapter of my professional life. It was the inevitable, natural consequence of willful ignorance, a storm that had been brewing since the first click of his shoes. Christopher offered a small, almost apologetic smile, as if attempting to cushion a blow he believed was softer than it was. Of course, we profoundly appreciate your years of dedicated service. HR has prepared a severance package for you, 2 months of pay, plus any accrued vacation. It's very fair, Margaret. Linda, without meeting my gaze, slid a beige envelope across the table towards me. Still, I said nothing. Christopher leaned back slightly, mistaking my quiet composure for hesitation, perhaps even shock. I know this may be difficult news, Margaret, but change is absolutely necessary for growth. We have to be agile. I smiled then, just slightly. It was not a bitter smile, nor one born of anger. It was truly a quiet sorrow for him, for his profound lack of understanding. You're certain you can manage without me? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He gave a small, almost condescending laugh, a puff of air designed to convey supreme confidence. We'll be just fine, Margaret. We need to be more dynamic, more streamlined. It's nothing personal, you understand. Just business. I stood up, leaving the untouched envelope on the table. I looked at him then, truly looked, and saw not a powerful leader, but a boy playing dress-up with intricate, expensive toys he fundamentally failed to comprehend. I wish you good luck on Monday, I said simply, the words hanging in the air. Christopher blinked, momentarily puzzled by the strange, specific nature of my parting words. But then his shallow, confident smile returned, quickly erasing any trace of confusion. Thank you, Margaret. Best of luck to you as well. I walked out of the conference room without a backward glance, past Linda's fleeting, pitying look, past the curious, hesitant stares of my coworkers. I moved down the long hallway that had once felt like a second home, now just another sterile corridor in a place where I no longer belonged. Outside, the clouds had thickened, low and heavy, pressing down on the sprawling city skyline like a vast, gray ceiling. The first sparse drops of rain began to tap against the lobby windows as I reached the main exit. I did not stop. I did not cry. I didn't even allow my hands to tremble. By the time I reached my car, the rain had begun in earnest, transforming the world beyond the windshield into a blurred, impressionistic watercolor. I sat there, gripping the steering wheel, a strange amalgam of grief and grim satisfaction swirling within me. They believed they could replace me. They truly thought that a contract with a faceless, external firm could serve as a substitute for 17 years of accumulated understanding, of painstakingly built trust, of intricate cultural nuance. They genuinely believed they were prepared. They weren't. And Monday, I knew, would prove it. The weekend following my dismissal was strangely peaceful, almost serene. I meticulously cleaned out my home office, a cathartic act of decluttering. I answered a few sympathetic texts from former colleagues, the braver ones, at least. Others remained conspicuously silent, likely fearful that any association with me would somehow paint a target on their own backs. I didn't blame them. On Sunday night, with a quiet sense of purpose, I updated my resume. It was not an act of desperation. It was simply practical. I had, after all, built something over those 17 years, something far more valuable than a mere job title or a designated desk. I had cultivated relationships, forged a reputation, earned trust. Those things did not simply vanish because Christopher Rains, in his hubris, believed he could erase me with a stroke of his pen. Monday morning dawned, the city stirring to life beneath a familiar gray sky. I dressed in a crisp navy blouse and simple, well-tailored slacks, tucked a slim portfolio under my arm, and walked into an interview at Lawson and Reed Global Consultants. A former colleague from an industry conference, having heard whispers of my sudden situation, had reached out just a day after my dismissal. They were in urgent need of someone who could expertly navigate East Asian business relations. Someone who didn't merely speak the language, but profoundly understood the complex cultural undercurrents beneath the contracts. The meeting was formal, yet surprisingly warm. Mr. Reed himself, a man whose reputation for shrewd but ethical dealings preceded him, shook my hand firmly. He asked pointed but respectful questions and, most importantly, he genuinely listened to my answers. It had been a long time, I realized, since I had felt truly, deeply heard in a room full of executives. By the time I returned home that afternoon, a generous offer, complete with a significantly better salary and greater autonomy, was waiting in my inbox. It was a genuine opportunity to build something substantive, rather than merely attempting to shore up the crumbling edifice of someone else's ego trip. I accepted without a moment's hesitation. Meanwhile, across town, Ridgemont and Wallace hummed with a nervous, agitated energy that I could almost feel even from a distance. My phone sporadically lit up with updates from the few friends who hadn't gone silent. "He's calling you a social climber now," one message read. "Said you were just trying to hold on to relevance, that the company's better off without old gatekeepers." Another message pinged. "They replaced you with an agency from Singapore. No dedicated liaison anymore, just rotating account managers. He says it's more efficient." I stared at the text without emotion. I knew Christopher's type intimately. When men like him failed, they never, ever blamed themselves. They invariably blamed the people they had discarded, meticulously rewriting the narrative to preserve their fragile pride. "Social climber," I murmured aloud, almost amused. If only he knew. If only he understood that I had never craved titles or public credit, only competence, only respect for the diligent, often thankless work that had meticulously built the very foundation he was now so casually dismantling. But Christopher didn't understand the intricate language of patience, or loyalty, or, most critically, consequence. Not yet. Monday evening, as the city lights flickered against the wet streets, casting shimmering reflections, I poured myself a comforting cup of tea. I opened my laptop, methodically checked the time difference between New York and Shenzhen, and reviewed a few obscure articles about contemporary corporate customs in China. Small details, yes, but profoundly important ones. The kind of subtle nuances Christopher's bright, shiny young hires would undoubtedly dismiss as outdated formalities. And then I waited. Because true storms do not announce themselves with a flourish of trumpets. They build slowly, steadily, gathering force, until the ground is utterly saturated, and the rivers inevitably overflow their banks. Tomorrow, the true consequences would begin, and I would not lift a single finger to stop them. Monday morning began, as it always did, with the usual corporate theater. The clatter of coffee cups, the rustle of stiff, expensive suits, the pervasive hum of artificial enthusiasm. Inside Ridgemont and Wallace, a small group of executives, Christopher among them, gathered on the 15th floor conference room, awaiting what they genuinely believed would be a routine, albeit crucial, meeting. Gold Peak Tech's delegation from Shenzhen was due to arrive in just under an hour. The deal on the table was monumental, a 3-year partnership renewal, valued at millions of dollars. It was not merely one of Ridgemont's cornerstone agreements. It was a contract that stabilized not only their quarterly targets, but their very reputation in the cutthroat arena of international markets. Christopher Rains sat at the head of the gleaming conference table, tapping his pen against his leather notebook with a nervous energy he tried to conceal. He threw occasional, impatient glances at the clock. To his left sat Martin and Carla, two of his hand-picked hires. Bright, undoubtedly ambitious, but utterly devoid of practical experience in the delicate art of international diplomacy. Across the city, I sat in the spacious, sunlit office of my new company, quietly sipping coffee as I opened my laptop. I didn't need to check the time. I knew precisely what was about to unfold. At 10:00 a.m. sharp, the Gold Peak representatives arrived. Mr. Liang, their Vice President of International Affairs, entered first, accompanied by two impeccably dressed senior advisors. They moved into the room with a quiet, almost understated grace that masked sharp, deeply intuitive instincts, a kind of presence Christopher clearly did not recognize, let alone respect. Christopher stood and extended his hand broadly, a salesman's overly eager grin plastered across his face.
Welcome, welcome.
So glad you could make it. The Gold Peak delegation exchanged stiff, formal handshakes. There were no bows, no perfunctory small talk. The atmosphere, instead of being cordial, was formal, even distinctly cold. Christopher, oblivious to the subtle shift, launched directly into his presentation, a torrent of corporate buzzwords, efficiency metrics, and aggressive cost-saving plans. He spoke quickly, confidently, flashing slides one after another without pausing for reaction or offering any opportunity for translation. Mr. Liang listened for a few moments, his expression utterly unreadable. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, he raised his hand, effectively stopping Christopher mid-sentence. "We would like to speak with Miss Margaret Lane," he stated politely, but with an unmistakable underlying firmness. The room fell silent. Christopher's forced smile faltered, a fleeting shadow crossing his features. He stammered slightly, caught off guard. "Margaret is no longer with the company. We've streamlined our communications to a new, highly efficient structure." Mr. Liang exchanged a brief, almost imperceptible glance with his advisors. No one spoke for a long, heavy moment. Finally, Mr. Liang broke the silence, his voice cool, measured, and utterly devoid of warmth. "Miss Lane was not simply a translator, Mr. Rains. She was our strategic partner. She understood our needs, our culture, our expectations. Without her, I am afraid we must reconsider the future of our cooperation." Christopher chuckled awkwardly, a hollow sound. "I assure you, sir, our new processes are even better suited to meet your—" Mr. Liang cut him off with a slight, almost imperceptible wave of his hand. "You have made a grave mistake," he said bluntly, his gaze piercing. "Firing Miss Lane demonstrates profound disrespect, both toward her and, by extension, toward our long-standing relationship." Christopher's face visibly reddened, a flush of indignation. I understand your concerns, but I believe in modernization and—" Mr. Liang rose slowly from his chair, followed immediately by his colleagues. "There will be no renewal of our agreement at this time," Mr. Liang stated, his voice final, resolute. "We value respect above all else. You have shown us none." Without another word, the delegation turned and left the room, their heels clicking sharply against the polished marble floor, each click a hammer blow. Christopher remained seated, staring blankly at the now empty doorway, as if willing them to miraculously return. Martin fumbled nervously with the laptop. Carla murmured something about following up later. But everyone in that room, including Christopher, knew, with a dawning, terrible clarity, that there would be no follow-up. Within an hour, word spread through the building like wildfire. A $24 million deal gone. By lunchtime, the CFO had already called an emergency board meeting. Investors were asking pointed, angry questions. Department heads scrambled frantically to contain the burgeoning fallout. Christopher, in his desperation, tried to spin the story. He blamed unexpected cultural complications, accused the Gold Peak team of being rigid and traditionalist. He even hinted that the outsourced firm in Singapore had somehow miscommunicated something. But the truth seeped through the cracks. He called Margaret incompetent. Someone whispered. He thought a contractor could replace a relationship 17 years in the making. He's finished. Meanwhile, across the city, I finished a client call, logged my notes, and stretched my arms above my head with a quiet, knowing smile. I hadn't lifted a finger. They had done it all themselves. and the storm I knew had only just begun. The next few days at Ridgemont and Wallace were a slow motion collapse, a corporate implosion viewed in agonizing detail. The canceled Gold Peak contract, once thought to be an isolated incident, proved to be merely the first domino. One by one, other international partners, once reliable mainstays, began expressing grave concerns about their existing agreements. Meetings were abruptly postponed, crucial negotiations stalled, and a few smaller, less prominent contracts were quietly, almost surreptitiously, terminated. Christopher's authority, once so smug and absolute, began to visibly erode, chipping away like a poorly constructed facade. His shiny new hires, so confident just weeks ago, now floundered, utterly unable to navigate the delicate, intricate network of relationships that Margaret had spent nearly 2 decades meticulously building. Inside the company, morale plummeted to an all-time low. Departments that had once prided themselves on stability and predictable growth now operated under a suffocating cloud of fear and confusion. Rumors swirled like a noxious fog about impending, drastic budget cuts. Middle management whispered anxiously about emergency board meetings being called behind ever more closed doors. It was almost too easy to watch, a grim spectacle. On Thursday morning, just 4 days after the disastrous meeting with Gold Peak, my phone rang. An unknown number. I let it go to voicemail, a small smirk playing on my lips. 30 minutes later, it rang again. This time, the caller ID displayed an old office extension, one I recognized instantly. Curious, I finally picked up. Margaret. "Christopher here," came the voice, artificially bright, laced with an undeniable tremor of desperation. "Hope you're well." I leaned back in my chair, allowing a slight smile to grace my lips. "I'm very well, thank you." Good. He continued, rushing through the awkwardness, trying to bridge the chasm he himself had created. "I was hoping we could talk. Clear the air. Maybe discuss some opportunities to collaborate again." Collaborate, I repeated dryly, letting the single word hang in the air, weighted with irony. Yes, he insisted, grasping at straws. Obviously, there were misunderstandings, transitional hiccups. "I think we could absolutely find a way to reintegrate your expertise. Maybe on a consulting basis. No formal title necessary. Just assisting where needed." In other words, he wanted the benefit of my labor without having to restore my dignity. He didn't want to admit he had made a catastrophic error. He merely wanted a quick, convenient patch for the gaping hole he had so carelessly torn. Nothing more. I let the silence stretch, allowing it to become profoundly uncomfortable. "Of course," he added hurriedly, mistaking my quiet for hesitation. "I'd compensate your time naturally." I considered my answer carefully. I could have simply said no, flat out. I could have hung up, leaving him to drown in the depths of his own arrogance. But something stirred within me. Not bitterness, not outright rage. Something colder, sharper, a precise calculation, an opportunity. "Let's meet," I said finally, my voice even calm. "Tomorrow, 9 a.m. My office." Christopher sounded almost absurdly relieved.
Great, fantastic. See you then.
I ended the call without another word. That evening, as the city darkened into a blurred tapestry of lights and soft, persistent rain, I sat at my kitchen table and meticulously plotted my next move. Christopher wanted help without humility. He wanted salvation without confession. And he would, I resolved, profoundly regret asking. The next morning, I prepared meticulously. A simple navy dress, minimal jewelry, my face carefully composed to reveal no visible emotion. Christopher arrived precisely 10 minutes late, just long enough to cultivate an air of business, still clinging to the illusion that he held all the cards. He wore the same expensive watch, but the confident swagger that had once accompanied his smile was now cracked and brittle, a fragile shell. "Margaret," he said, striding into the glass-walled conference room of my new office. "Good to see you again." I shook his hand coolly, my touch brief, and gestured for him to sit. He launched immediately into his rehearsed pitch, attempting to frame the entire disastrous situation as a mutual opportunity. There were challenges, he admitted. A few temporary misunderstandings with partners. He meticulously avoided using the word failure. His pride simply wouldn't permit it. I listened without interruption, my expression as neutral as a blank canvas. At the end, he spread his hands, a gesture of feigned openness, and said, "Would just need someone deeply familiar with these clients to step in and smooth things over. No need to get tangled in titles or structures, just practical support." I let the silence hang for a moment, thick and heavy, before I spoke. "You're offering me a consulting role," I said slowly, deliberately. "No authority, no public acknowledgement of my previous value, no correction of the lies you spread after I left." Christopher flushed slightly, his veneer of confidence beginning to peel away. "It's not personal, Margaret, it's business." I smiled then, a small, razor-thin smile that held no warmth. "So is my answer." He blinked, uncertain, a flicker of confusion in his eyes. "I'll consider your offer," I said smoothly, "but on my terms." "What terms?" he asked warily, his voice tight. "You'll see," I said, rising from my seat, signaling the end of the meeting. Because now, I had everything I needed. I wasn't going back to save him. I was going back to demonstrate, unequivocally, to him and to everyone watching, precisely how much damage a woman they had so carelessly underestimated could inflict. And this time, they would know exactly whose hand held the blade. The first rule of revenge, if executed with proper precision, is patience. Not rage, not noise, but unyielding patience. I spent the weekend after that meeting meticulously planning, refining my strategy. I wasn't going to storm back into Ridgemont and Wallace demanding theatrical retribution. That would have rendered me small, reactive, precisely the kind of person Christopher already assumed I was. No, my method would be slower, sharper, surgical in its execution. On Monday, under the terms of a short-term consultancy contract that Christopher, in his desperation, had hurriedly signed without properly reading, I re-entered the building. There was no public announcement, no new title to be trumpeted, just a quiet agreement and discreet access to certain internal systems. He genuinely believed he was using me, pulling me back into his orbit as a stopgap measure. He was profoundly mistaken. The office atmosphere had undergone a profound transformation since I had last walked its hallways. Gone was the casual friendliness, the easy rhythm of people who trusted the ground beneath their feet. Now, there was only a brittle, strained silence, occasionally punctuated by hurried, hushed conversations and forced, hollow laughter. Christopher greeted me in the main lobby with the forced cheer of a man desperately trying to pretend he hadn't just set his own house ablaze. "Margaret, welcome back," he exclaimed, louder than necessary, drawing a few curious, furtive glances from nearby employees. I offered a polite, noncommittal smile, said nothing, and followed him to the temporary workspace they had arranged for me, a sterile, glass-walled box situated between two bustling departments. It was a clear, unambiguous sign that I was physically present, yet not truly welcomed, not integrated. Perfect. By noon I had gained full access to the client database. By mid-afternoon I had quietly, discreetly contacted Mr. Lyon. Not through corporate email. I wasn't foolish enough for that. I called him directly on a private number he had given me years ago, back when mutual trust had been a sacred cornerstone between our business entities. He answered after the second ring. "Ems Lane," he said warmly, though there was an underlying note of wary curiosity in his voice. "To what do I owe this honor?" I spoke in Mandarin, slowly and respectfully, as was proper for the intricate relationship we had built over so many years. "I owe you an apology," I began, my voice steady, "for my sudden, unexplained departure and the regrettable confusion that followed." Mr. Lyon was silent for a moment, processing the unexpected weight of my words. "I understand," he said finally, Circumstances are sometimes beyond our control. Sometimes, I agreed softly, and sometimes they are the direct result of poor judgment. A long pause, then a low chuckle from his end of the line. Not cruel, but profoundly knowing. I see, he said. Perhaps it is time we consider new partners. I leave that decision entirely to your wisdom, Mr. Liang. I responded respectfully. But I would be honored to work with you again, should the opportunity arise. We concluded the call with formal goodbyes, every word carefully measured, every nuance understood. And just like that, the first, critical stone had been subtly removed from beneath Christopher's crumbling foundation. By the end of that week, I had arranged a formal introduction between Mr. Liang and the executive team at Lawson & Reed. There was no fanfare, no public announcements, just a quiet meeting in a discreet, private room. Christopher, meanwhile, continued to stumble through frantic damage control at Ridgemont and Wallace, utterly unaware that the future he was desperately fighting to salvage was, inch by agonizing inch, slipping irrevocably into my hands. I wasn't acting out of hatred, nor even out of raw anger anymore. This was a deeper, colder impulse justice, delivered quietly, precisely, and with an unassailable certainty, and soon it would be complete. It didn't happen all at once. Companies rarely collapse in a sudden, explosive implosion. They rot from the inside slowly at first, then with accelerating, inevitable speed. The week after Gold Peak Tech definitively severed ties with Ridgemont and Wallace, the dominoes began to fall with a chilling predictability. Smaller accounts, once reliable, quietly closed. Vendors, sensing the instability, began demanding shorter, more stringent payment terms. A major European client, having caught wind of the escalating rumors of financial instability, unilaterally froze all pending contracts. Inside Ridgemont's offices, the atmosphere was no longer merely tense. It was openly panicked. Employees walked faster, their steps hurried, their faces drawn. They spoke less, their voices hushed, wary. Managers who had once proudly boasted about streamlining processes now held emergency meetings behind tightly closed doors, their faces etched with desperation. Layoffs began again, this time without the polite fiction of restructuring. Severance packages shrank dramatically, resignation letters piled up, and still, Christopher clung stubbornly to the deluded idea that he could somehow, miraculously fix it. He called frantic, all-hands meetings. He gave long, rambling speeches about innovation and resilience. He blamed the market, the global economy, even the vague specter of cultural differences. He never, not once, blamed himself. Meanwhile, I worked methodically, almost invisibly. I reached out to 2 other former Ridgemont partners. Not directly, of course. My influence was exerted through whispers, through carefully placed suggestions, through seemingly casual conversations with industry contacts. I simply made it known that at Lawson & Reed, we profoundly understood the intrinsic value of respect, of continuity, of true, reciprocal partnership. They didn't require much convincing. By the second Friday, another 2 major accounts had quietly, seamlessly slipped out of Ridgemont's rapidly shrinking portfolio. Christopher's personal assistants began sending me panicked, desperate messages, asking for advice on how to rebuild client confidence. The irony would have been amusing had it not been so profoundly pathetic. Late that afternoon, an official email arrived in my inbox, originating from the CFO's office at Ridgemont. It curtly announced that Ridgemont and Wallace was initiating a temporary suspension of all new business initiatives. Translation: they were hemorrhaging cash, bleeding out. I closed my laptop, took a deep, fortifying breath, and decided it was time. Time to end this, properly. On Monday morning, I called Christopher and requested a meeting. He agreed immediately, his voice laced with palpable desperation. Eager for anything that even remotely resembled a solution, we met in the same sterile, glass, walled conference room where he had first condescendingly offered me my consulting role. He looked considerably worse now. The expensive watch was still on his wrist, a futile symbol of his rapidly dwindling power. But his face was drawn, his eyes heavily ringed with exhaustion. "Margaret," he said, forcing a grin that didn't reach his tired eyes. "I'm glad you wanted to meet. We really need your insight now more than ever. Maybe we can turn this corner together." I cut him off with a raised hand, a silent, absolute gesture of command. "I'm not here to advise you, Christopher," I said calmly, my voice steady and unwavering. He blinked, confused, his carefully constructed facade momentarily crumbling. "What do you mean?" "I'm here to tell you that this is the end." A flicker of something, anger, then raw fear, crossed his face. He opened his mouth to speak, but I didn't give him a chance. "You fired me without understanding what I did. You replaced me with a contractor you didn't vet, a firm you knew nothing about. You called me a social climber. You told everyone you didn't need me." I leaned forward slightly, my voice still low and controlled, each word a precisely aimed dart. "You were wrong." He shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his gaze darting around the room, desperate for an escape. "I'm the reason Gold Peak Tech pulled out," I stated flatly, watching the color drain from his face. "I'm the reason Lawson and Reed is now signing the clients you are so rapidly losing." His mouth dropped open slightly, a silent gasp of horror. You did this?" he breathed, the words barely a whisper. "I didn't sabotage anything, Christopher," I said coolly, my voice devoid of emotion. "I simply reminded our former partners what respect looks like. They made their own decisions." He sat there, stunned, paralyzed, trying to piece together the utter ruin that surrounded him, trying to comprehend the true architect of his downfall. I calmly gathered my folder, stood up. "I came back not to save you," I said, my voice like ice. "I came back to make sure you saw who dismantled your little empire." He rose shakily to his feet, his hands trembling slightly, impotent rage warring with dawning despair. "You'll regret this," he said, his voice hoarse, a desperate, final threat. I smiled then, a real smile this time, one touched with genuine, profound satisfaction. "No, Christopher," I said, my voice quiet, resolute. "You will." Without another word, I walked out. I didn't look back. Not at the office, not at Christopher, not at the broken, empty shell of a company collapsing behind me. Some endings don't require grand finales, no dramatic explosions. Sometimes, it's enough to simply know you walked away, while the fire you never started burned everything they thought they owned to ash.